I'll be reading to make use of every single word, and the conclusions of the text will probably in the Q&A period, so just a presentation. The publication of the Armenian history textbook by the Armenian History Department at Yerevan State University in 2012 was immediately disparaged by government opponents for its one-sided coverage of the bloody events in Yerevan on March 1, 2008. Critics said it presents solely the official viewpoint and lays full blame on the protesters. In 2015, the textbook was also formally attacked by the opposition Armenian National Congress for its partisan analysis of many post-1988 developments. Beside these politically fueled criticisms, however, there have been, to my limited knowledge, very few attempts to analyze other aspects of the textbook, which cover some 5,000 years of history. This presentation will try to somewhat fill that gap. The Armenian History Department is among Yerevan State University's oldest structures. However, for a variety of ideological and political reasons, which turned into obstacles, its first Armenian history survey textbook appeared in a multi-volume edition only between 1958 and 1964. However, only 8 of the planned 12 volumes saw the light during this first attempt, which was soon superseded by a slightly edited but comprehensive 4-volume edition between 1963 and 1970. A third, again slightly amended 2-volume set was issued between 1975 and 1979. Soviet-era textbooks reflected the views of the communist hierarchy of the day. With the formal adoption of democracy, and political and ideological pluralism among the founding principles of post-Soviet Armenia, a fresh look back at the nation's history became inevitable. Yet the Armenian History Department proved slow in joining this effort. Only in 2004 did it publish a new Armenian History College textbook for non-history majors. The 2012 edition is an expanded version of the 2004 textbook. Nevertheless, the scope of topics it covers continues to remain less encompassing than that of its Soviet-era antecedents. It has no chapter on the prehistoric era and the political and social history of the period extending from the Mongols to 1800 of the Common Era. The 19th century is also covered only partially. It is surprising that these centuries, omitted in the political history section, are nevertheless covered in the separate chapters dealing with Armenian culture. By 2004, authoritarian tendencies had become all too apparent in post-Soviet Armenia. In recent years, political power has gradually accumulated in the hands of the Hanapetagan party. The latter is by now nothing more than an ostensibly modern and a formal constitutional facade to the country's entrenched oligarchic structure. The party professes a national conservative ideology, and its Minister of Education was quick to defend the textbook in face of criticism in 2012. The textbook praises the changes in historiography in Armenia since 1991. Similar to its Soviet-era antecedents, it has no introduction outlining its ideological and methodological principles. Yet, it quotes approvingly from a 2012 government document vowing, and here I'm quoting, to turn Armenian studies through the efforts of the state and the intellectual class into a strong factor guaranteeing the national and cultural security of Armenians. The same document also foresees that Armenian studies would stimulate the consolidation of independent statehood and contribute to the growth of national self-consciousness. This presentation will try to detect the main ideological foundations of the 2012 textbook through content analysis and comparison with its Soviet-era antecedents. This is arguably an appropriate tool to compare the official ideologies of post-Stalin Soviet Armenian totalitarianism with current Hanapetagan authoritarianism, under which the Armenian History Department has functioned and produced. And my remarks now. The textbook is written primarily with an ethnic Armenian readership in mind. The editor and 13 contributors share a common educational background, having overwhelmingly received their higher education in full in Yerevan. Only 2 authors out of 14 have studied in Moscow, and that only for their candidatura, which is the middle degree. While the Soviet-era textbook asserted that the area of the historical Armenian homeland totaled 300,000 square kilometers, the new textbook raises this to 400,000 square kilometers. even with mountainous Karabakh now controlling around 12,500 square kilometers, in addition to the Republic of Armenia's 30,000 square kilometers, the textbook still asserts that Armenian statehood is currently preserved only on 1/10 of the territory of the medieval Medzhaik. It also approves of all past efforts to expand sovereign Armenian territory as steps towards the fulfillment of historical justice. The Soviet-era textbook put the beginning of the process of formation of the Armenian people at the end of the 7th century before the Common Era, at the time of the Urartian decline, and its end at the beginning of the 2nd century before the Common Era. The new textbook attributes an even longer lineage to Armenians. It puts the beginning of the process at the end of the 4th and the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, when speakers of the Armenian language reportedly separated from other Indo-Europeans, and it fixes its end in the 6th to 5th centuries BC. Urartu, now called the Kingdom of Arat in this textbook, is depicted simply as one link in a continuous chain of Armenian peoplehood and statehood. Marxism is out of the new textbook as the guiding ideology. So is the periodization of history according to modes of production. No new periodization scheme is provided, except the listing of successive dynasties and periods of foreign rule. The red thread in the new textbook is the argument that Armenian statehood persisted on the Armenian highland almost continuously from the state of Aratta in the 28th to 26th centuries BC to the Mongol invasions in the 13th century AD. Urartu, the Yerevan after Alexander the Great, the Artaxerxes, the Arshagunis, Bagradunis, and the Armenian state in Cilicia have long been treated as sovereign entities in modern Armenian historiography. However, the 2012 textbook argues, in addition, that the Yerevan dynasty enjoyed full internal autonomy earlier than thought. That is also from the 6th to the 4th centuries BC, under the Medes and the Persians, and that the fundamental features of statehood also survived in Armenia between the 5th and 9th centuries AD under Sassanid, Byzantine, and Arab rule. Moreover, under the Seljuks in the 11th, 12th centuries, regional Armenian kings, princes, and clergymen continued to run most of Armenia's internal affairs. Then, going back to an established tradition, the textbook portrays the Zakarians in the 12th, 13th centuries as almost equals to their Georgian suzerains. Furthermore, it praises a number of failed attempts by rebellious Armenian Nakharars against successive empires to restore Armenian independent statehood. After the Mongol invasions, the textbook stops covering political history in Armenia until the early 20th century. Instead, it concentrates on certain episodes of the Armenian liberation movement. Among these, it interprets the military successes of Armenians in Syunik and Artsakh in the 1720s as restored Armenian national independence. It further argues that Nadir Shah institutionalized Karabakh's administrative self-governance to the 5 Meliktons. However, despite this repeated use of the term statehood, the textbook fails to provide a clear list of criteria for us to decide whether we can call a certain level of political authority over a specific territory a state or not. In its coverage of modern times, the textbook speaks supportively about independent Armenia between 1918 and 1920. Its treatment of the Soviet period is varied, but the latter is still called the Second Republic, the achievements of which reportedly made possible the eventual emergence of the current Third Republic. Developments in the late Ottoman Empire, leading to the genocide of World War I, constitute an important part of the Armenian liberation movement. Despite its importance and actuality, this section shows more than anything else in the textbook that historiography in Armenia remains largely disconnected from research and methodology worldwide. The chapter on genocide is arguably one of the weakest. Its content does not differ much from what Soviet-era historians used to write on this subject in the late 1950s. The new textbook allocates significantly more and positive coverage than its Soviet-era counterparts to the activities of the Armenagan, Hunchager, and Dashnak parties in the late Ottoman era. Other parties active among Armenians in the same era are simply mentioned in passing. The Armenian Bolsheviks are not brought up in any context before the Russian revolutions of 1917. The textbook labels Soviet Azerbaijani policies in Karabakh and Nakhichevan as colonialist. It is supportive of what it describes as the just and popular Karabakh movement. However, it downplays the leading role of the Karabakh Committee, and as the movement gradually metamorphoses into independent statehood, it gets critical of government action under Levon Ter-Petrosyan. In contrast, it does not hold either Robert Kocharian or Serge Sarkisian personally responsible for any shortcoming since 1998. Among Armenia's neighbors, Azerbaijanis and Turks are consistently shown in negative light. Of the Western nations, the British are mentioned the most, and again generally in negative context. The treatment of Georgians, Kurds, and Russians is mixed, while ancient and medieval Iranians, except the Parthians, are depicted largely in negative terms until the early 19th century, but their present-day heirs since 1991 are talked about quite positively. The textbook unshakably emphasizes Armenian unity, overriding regional class and religious divides as necessary for national success. The uniqueness of Armenian culture is underlined recurrently, probably to further enhance national solidarity. While social history continues to grow worldwide, the 2012 textbook has significantly reduced the pages which its Soviet-era counterparts used to divide to this discipline. Moreover, even this small amount of social history is internally inconsistent. Some epochs are covered, while others are not, without any explanation. The life of the upper class is analyzed in certain time periods, while the middle and lower classes are always totally ignored. This shrinking of social history may also be tied to the textbook's total blackout of all forms of intra-Armenian social conflict. Religious, sectarian, peasant, and workers' movements, most notably the medieval Polikians and the Tondrakians, all highlighted in Soviet-era textbooks, are now kicked out unceremoniously. The textbook also consistently avoids analysis of gender relations. Armenian women are mentioned in their own right only on a handful of occasions. The Armenian Apostolic Church hierarchy in post-Soviet Armenia is now a close ally of the state structures and the established oligarchs. Nevertheless, the textbook devotes very little space to the Armenian Church, at times even less than its Soviet-era counterparts. The uninformed reader may deduce from what is presented that the Armenian Church has remained unchanged since Armenia adopted Christianity in the 4th century. No explanation is given as to why Armenians call themselves apostolic. There is no mention of early Armenian Catholicoi being ordained in Caesarea, and no direct reference to any ecumenical council, including Chalcedon. The reader is suddenly told, when reading about mid-7th century developments, that the Byzantine emperor tried to impose the Chalcedonian creed upon Armenians without any prior explanation about what this creed is. The same holds true for all future references to Roman Catholic attempts to convert Armenians. The various hierarchical sees of the Armenian Church in history are occasionally mentioned, but with extremely little explanation about how they had come about and or how they had ceased to be. Armenian Catholics and evangelicals also get very rare mentions, and again without any explanation about their origins or their current structure and following. And finally, a more methodological thing, some of the textbooks above mentioned conclusions will evidently be challenged by readers. What makes this more problematic, however, is that the textbook's total lack of effort to encourage critical thinking among its prospective student users. Only a person with deep prior knowledge of Armenian history will be able to differentiate in the published text between facts emanating from primary sources and present-day historians' interpretations. There are only a handful of instances when the reader becomes aware, directly or through polemic, that there are also competing interpretations of the particular event described. Thank you.
Thank you very much.